this should be a particularly good event. I'm looking forward to it very much. Our speaker for tonight is Jacopo Nisci. He is an art historian, and he tells me that his actual job is a lecturer in art and visual cultures of the global south at UCL in London, and he's a visiting academic at the British Museum. So he is a very respectable academic, and he is not the sort of person who usually gets involved in Indiana Jones style treasure hunts, but something unprecedented and interesting happened to him last year, and he's here. He's with us from Tuscany to tell you all about it. And I'll hand you over now to Jacopo.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'd like to start by thanking the Anglo-Ethiopian Society for inviting me to give this presentation to their annual AGM, to thank the guests that have come up to this virtual lecture, and I'm in particular aware of several representatives from different embassies that are following this, so I thank them for their participation, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a short second, but let me start by sharing my screen. So, as the title gives away, this evening I will be talking about a stolen crown. And in presenting this story, I'm well aware that I am just one cog in a complex mechanism made up of several people and institutions which enabled this crown to be returned, as we shall see in the course of the presentation, from the Netherlands to Ethiopia. And because of this awareness that I was just sort of a small part, I played a small part in this story, I thought it would be good to reach out to some of the other actors that were involved in this, to see if they had something to say or wanted to contribute to the lecture together with me. I thus reached out to Sirak Asfal and to Michael Jervis, whose role in the story I'll be clarifying further on. I'm glad to say that Michael has been able to join us. Sirak hasn't been able to make it tonight, but he has sent me a video message, which I'll be playing later on. I also reached out to representatives of Mekelle University, who expressed a willingness to participate to this evening's discussion, but were concerned about the quality of the internet connection at this time in Ethiopia. I also reached out to Arthur Brand, who, as you'll see, also plays a big part in the story. And finally, I reached out to the Ethiopian embassy in London, who have kindly sent me a statement to read on their behalf. And it's from this statement that I'll be starting. The embassy welcomes this virtual public lecture on the repatriation of the Crown of Chelakot to Ethiopia from the Netherlands earlier this year. And thanks Dr. Nisci, the Anglo-Ethiopian Society, and others for facilitating this important platform. The repatriation of the lost crown back to its rightful home in Ethiopia is the embodiment of Ethiopia's long-standing efforts to ensure that heritage items and stolen artifacts are returned to the peoples and cultures that produce them. As with the historic return of locks of hair belonging to Emperor Theodosius II from the United Kingdom in March 2019, the homecoming of this rare crown and product of Ethiopian ingenuity is a just outcome for the people of Ethiopia. The embassy wishes to take this opportunity to congratulate everyone involved in the return of the crown and to encourage others to take inspiration from this example in the campaigns to come. Ethiopia's long-standing campaign to repatriate its heritage from overseas spans more than a century and has involved successive governments demanding the return of loot from museums and private collections across the world. Today, our position remains steadfast. The embassy in recent years has accelerated campaigns to restitute loot plundered at the Battle of Magdala, held in museums across the United Kingdom. From the 11 holy tablets at the British Museum to the priceless textiles and artifacts at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the embassy has asserted the rights of Ethiopians in Ethiopia to access, study, and admire their history in person. In the words of the Minister of Culture and Tourism and Sport, Her Excellency Dr. Hira Kassau, these are not simply artifacts or treasures, but constitute a fundamental part of the existential fabric of Ethiopia and its people. In other words, our history forms part of our today and our tomorrows. It is our belief that the restitution of our heritage can be the spark that lights the path to development and the key to unlocking Ethiopia's prosperity. Thus, we urge all Ethiopians in the diaspora and friends of Ethiopia across the world to continue to campaign, raise awareness, and advocate for the restitution of these treasures, giving voice to the many voices in Ethiopia, the pride of these windows to our common history. We wish you a fruitful discussion and look forward to hearing further engagements in the future. So that's the message from the Ethiopian Embassy, which again I thank for contributing to this evening. And again, what I'm going to do really this evening is just present my side of the story and my view of how the events unfold. Everything started off with this email, which I got about a year ago from a gentleman called Arthur Brand, who basically contacted me to talk about some looted religious Ethiopian artifact which he had come across during his research. Now, as many of you might know, art historians tend to get a lot of questions for the authentication of objects, and I'm always quite hesitant to reply to such emails unless I feel very confident about the purpose to which this information will therefore be put. In other words, I do not want to provide estimates or opinions of any kind if they are in any way going to be a conduit for the selling of illegally trafficked artworks. And so a little back and forth went on between me and Arthur Brand, where I was trying to get a sense of what he was talking about and what his objectives were, and he was trying to get a sense of whether or not I was a reliable person before sharing any information with me. And after 3 or 4 emails, I decided to Google Arthur, and it turned out that he had been involved in a number of high-end cases of stolen artifacts, ranging from stolen Byzantine mosaics to statues taken away during the Second World War, stolen Picasso, and even a golden ring lost, which was stolen from Oxford and used to belong to Oscar Wilde. And so I decided at this point that I could trust Arthur, and I therefore expressed a willingness to contribute to this and asked him to send me a photograph of the object he wanted to know more about. And at that point, in my inbox came the following 2 pictures, and I had quite a wow effect at that point. I wasn't expecting this level of artifact to come through to me. And I immediately realized that I was dealing with something important, and of course, I was immediately curious as to how on earth this had got to Holland, to a small apartment in Holland where it was apparently being kept. So Arthur kindly invited me to come over to Holland, to Rotterdam in particular, where the crown was being kept, and to have a look at it and see if I could say anything else about it. So in the next 2 days, I packed my bag, and traveling was quite easy still back in 2019. So on I got into a train, and off I went to the Netherlands. As I was traveling to the Netherlands, I had a series of questions going through my mind, such as where was the crown made, where did it come from, what was its original function, what kind of meaning did it have for those who used it, and most importantly, how did such a precious object end up in Holland, and to whom should it be returned? And tonight, what I'm really going to be doing is exploring some of these questions, again, very much from my subjective perspective. So first of all, a bit of background. Crowns have a long history in Ethiopia, and there are 2 main types of crowns. We have royal crowns, that is to say, crowns that were used by sovereigns, and priestly crowns, that is to say, crowns that are used by members of the clergy. Now, the use of royal crowns in Ethiopia, as far as we can tell, goes back all the way till the 1st or 2nd century AD. Crowns were used by the sovereigns of this powerful Ethiopian empire, which is known as the Aksumite Empire, and which flourished approximately from the 1st century AD to the 6th, 7th centuries AD. As a result of trade which it managed to tap into, exploiting the Red Sea corridor, which connected trade goods from the Mediterranean going back and forth to the Indian Ocean. And by tapping into this trade network, the kings of Aksum managed to gain considerable wealth, but they also came into contact with a range of peoples and cultures from different parts of the world. And it was probably as a result of such connections that Christianity eventually gained a foothold in Ethiopia, approximately towards the mid-4th century AD. At a point in time when an Ethiopian king, Zana, decided to embrace Christianity and make it a religion of state. And from this point onwards, we have depictions of Ethiopian kings wearing all sorts of crowns, or different kinds of crowns on their coins. Prior to the conversion of Christianity, these crowns features embellishments such as a serpent, possibly a detail inspired by through connections with the kingdoms of Nubia. And subsequently, after the conversion of the Ethiopian kings to Christianity, these crowns are often topped by a cross, such as the one that you see here on your slide from a 6th century coin of an Aksumite ruler. A variety of crowns were in use in Ethiopia, as I said. One type of crown involved the wearing of a headband, a cloth headband around the head, which was tied up at the end and had 2 streamers left dangling from behind the back. And during the Middle Ages, this type of crown must have been seen distinctive as a distinctive symbol of kingship of Aksumite rulers, since we find references to it far beyond the concept of Ethiopia. John Malalas, for instance, mentions it in his Chronographia, and headcloth also appears as a distinctive attribute of the ruler of Ethiopia in the wall paintings at Kusai Ramra. And indeed, Ethiopian rulers continued to wear crowns right until the deposition of Haile Selassie, the last Ethiopian emperor, in the 20th century. And these crowns were used as part of a broader population of objects, which would have included scepters, clothing, robes, parasols, as items of regalia to mark their status. Another important thing that emperors of Ethiopia did was support ecclesiastical institutions, and they did this in a number of ways, through the donation of land, through the donation of books for the liturgy, but also, more relevantly for today's presentation, through the donation of objects, including crowns. Indeed, local traditions assert that an early Aksumite Ethiopian king, King Caleb, sent his crown to be hung on the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem upon his abdication already in the 6th century. And we don't quite know if the practice of donating crowns to ecclesiastical institutions dates as far back as this, but there is certainly a long continuous tradition of Ethiopian sovereigns donating their crowns to ecclesiastical institutions in Ethiopia. The second type of crowns that are used commonly in Ethiopia are crowns that are worn by priests. And Ethiopia in this respect is distinctive because while in other Oriental Orthodox tradition, the use of crowns is generally reserved for the highest ranking clergymen, in Ethiopia also priests and deacons are allowed to wear liturgical crowns on special liturgical days. And there are 2 main types of crowns that are used by the priests. The first type is in the shape of a tiara, and it's typically called a klil, whereas the second type, to which the stolen crown belongs to, is a dome-shaped element, which is often topped by a cross and generally placed on a square-shaped base. And you see an example here to the right of some Ethiopian priests wearing an array of such crowns on a liturgical celebration. This is a photograph that was taken near the Cathedral of Aksum Seyon towards the 1930s. The Ethiopian craftsmen who made crowns such as the one that ended up in Holland must have had in mind Old Testament passages such as Zechariah 6:11, who reads, I quote, "Take the silver and gold and make a crown and set it on the head of the high priest Joshua, son of Josedek." And it's no coincidence that I mention an Old Testament passage, because Ethiopia is a country where the Old Testament had and has a strongly prominent role in shaping the practices and beliefs also of Christian communities. And typological comparisons with Old Testament figures, a recurring feature of Ethiopian literature. And in fact, often the king's countries are compared to Old Testament figures such as David and Solomon, and the country's saints and holiest men frequently compared to Old Testament's prophets and priests. And likewise, some of the customs and practices which are unique and distinctive to the Ethiopian church are often done in adherence to the Old Testament. But of course, to the Ethiopian priests who wore such crowns, but also to the people who saw them, the very act of wearing these objects must have also evoked passages such as that by Revelation 2:10, which says, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give thee a crown of life." And Revelation 4:4, which reads, I open quote, "Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their head." Now, this last passage refers to the vision of the throne of God in heaven, which is a theme that often is depicted in Ethiopian churches. And the version you see here shows the Trinity at the center. We're looking at a 19th century wall painting from the Church of Debre Biran Selassie in Gonda. So we see the Trinity, the four Godhead figures at the center, surrounded by the tetramorph, which sometimes taken to symbolize the evangelists Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And they are further surrounded by a group of priests. And if you can see the lines of priests here and here, and the lines of priests to the right over here, they're all wearing crowns. And so to the people who beheld these images during the liturgy and then would have seen the priests wearing this crown must have acquired a sense of being very active participants in sacred history itself. Where there's this mimesis where reality replicates aspects of the Holy Scriptures, and the Holy Scriptures are interpreted in a way that reflects elements of reality. And this is a recurring dynamic among Christian Ethiopians. And to touch further on the symbolism of crown, there's also a set of imagery which is implicit within the crown itself. And it's on its many structures. So up at the very top, we have a representation of God, surrounded again by the tetramorphs. At the very upper level of the crown represents God and heaven. And then we have a middle tier with spheres, which are topped by four small little angels. These, of course, reflect the four corners of heaven, the crucifixion. And then these are followed by a group of evangelists on the lower middle tier, which are depicted under arches in embossed metal around the sides of the crown. And for those of you who can read Ethiopic, then have their names written next to them. And finally, the lower tier would have been represented, of course, by the priest or by the deacon who would have worn this crown and who represented the sort of the final link, the chain between heaven and earth, and hence the title of the lecture, A Bridge Between Two Worlds. The next question that I was interested in concerned the dating of the crown. And usually for this kind of object, the crown actually has an inscription on its visor, which says that it was donated in the time of the reign of Emperor Fasilides in the year 1626 of the Ethiopian calendar. Which runs about 7 or 8 years behind the European calendar, which does give us a date of approximately 1633, 1634. Now, this date is compatible with the reign of Emperor Fasilides, who was one of the best known and influential Ethiopian rulers, and who governed from his capital, his newly found capital in Gonda, from 1632 to 1667. He is known, among other things, for expelling a group of Jesuit missionaries who had set foothold in Ethiopia, and thus ending a civil war in which the country had been embroiled for about a decade. Let me just show you a castle that is associated with this particular sovereign for which he is well known. And so the connection with Fasilides was an important one and a tempting link. But at the same time, I was not convinced by this inscription for two reasons. The first reason is that it was produced using a technique which appears to be different from that used for inscribing the names of the evangelists on the side of the crown. And I discussed this also with my friend and colleague, Antonella Brita, and she also agreed with me that the paleography of this inscription appeared to be different from the one used for the inscriptions on the side of the crown. So first of all, it looks like an inscription that was added at a subsequent date from the actual production of the object. And the second reason I was inclined to think that it had a later date was that the actual style of the reliefs was one that was more typical of the 18th century and of a series of other objects and other crowns that are kept currently in Ethiopia, and that we can date again by means of stylistic comparison with other objects such as manuscripts. So with regard to the date, I was more inclined to see it as an object produced towards the 18th century. The next question I wanted to tackle was, and perhaps the most crucial one, was the provenance. Arthur Brand, the art detective who had asked me to sort of look into this, wanted to know if it was in any way possible to reconstruct where the crown had been taken from. And this is, of course, an essential step in order to enable its restitution. It was quite clear that it must have had come from Ethiopia, but the monastery of provenance or the institution of provenance was unclear. I thus searched through my database of images, and I was lucky enough because I came across a photograph of the crown taken in 1993 by my friend and colleague Michael Jervis, who will be joining us, who has joined us for this lecture and will also be talking after me later today. And he had documented the crown at the church of Chelikot Selassie, which is the town of Chelikot is situated in the southern part of the Tigray region, which is in turn located in northeastern Ethiopia. So this got everybody very excited. Sirach, who was the gentleman who had been keeping this crown for 20 years, was thrilled, and he cried when I told him the news. And this also would have enabled the Dutch government to have a much clearer path towards the crown's restitution. A bit of background on what happened to the crown at this point was also possible to reconstruct. So together with Michael, we figured out that the crown must have been stolen after 1993, and it must have been somehow taken to Holland around 1998. At this point in time, an Ethiopian expat gentleman who was living in Holland, Sirach Asfau, was in the habit of giving hospitality to Ethiopians who were making their way into Europe. And his story, who he told me when I met him, was that one of the gentlemen who was staying at this place had this crown in his bag. And when Sirach saw this, he became considerably upset at the fact that a piece of Ethiopian history had been taken out of this country. And so he told the gentleman to leave the crown with him at this flat and to leave his house. At that point, Sirach had a bit of a conundrum because on the one hand, he wanted to see the crown returned to Ethiopia, but on the other hand, he was concerned that if it were returned immediately, it might be stolen yet again from the institution in question. And he ended up brooding on the matter for quite a while, in fact, 20 years. But he eventually got in touch with Arthur and told them all the story, and Arthur also actually did some investigations and verified the story. And together they decided, therefore, that it was time for the crown to go back. This is just to give you a sense of where this monastery is located. So it's located just here beneath the town of Mekelle. And this is just to give you a sense of the church of Chelikot Selassie from where the crown was taken. Up in the top corner, you see some frescoes of Michael and Gabriel, which mark the entrance to the sanctuary of the church. To the right, you see the landscape surrounding the church, and in the lower left corner, you see the church, the entrance to the church compound, and this goblet, which has an interesting story because it was donated at the turn of the 19th century by King George III to Ethiopia, and it eventually ended up in the collection of this monastery. So it's a monastery which has a rich collection of artifacts, and we'll be returning to it shortly. So the next question I decided to entertain and see if I could try to answer was, well, we've established that the crown was produced in the 18th century. We've established that the crown comes from the Church of Chelekot Selassie, and that it was taken to the Netherlands circa 1998. The one question that remains to be answered is, when did the crown actually go to the monastery of Chelekot Selassie? And as far as I saw it, there were two possible explanations as to the provenance of how the crown got to the monastery in the first place. The first explanation is that option one, is that it got there in the aftermath of the siege of Makhtala, which took place in 1868. Many members of the Anglo-Ethiopian Society will be familiar with this history, but I'll quickly go through it for those of you who are not familiar with it. Due to rising diplomatic tensions between the United Kingdom and Ethiopia, a punitive mission was sent in 1867 from India to attack the fortress of the then Ethiopian emperor, the then emperor of Ethiopia, Tewodros. And the attack ended up with a siege and the burning of the fortress. The emperor ended up taking his life. But Tewodros had built up over the years a large collection of objects and artifacts that he had acquired with the purpose of giving them to the Church of Medana Elem, Savior of the World, that was connected to his fortress at Makhtala. But once the British arrived there, they of course looted these objects with a view of selling them to raise money for the troops. While a lot of these objects, and again, this connects back to the message that the Ethiopian embassy sent at the beginning of the lecture, while a lot of these objects ended up in institutions in the UK, and we will be returning to this point at the end of the lecture, including manuscripts which are in the British Library, some tablets, some altar tablets which have ended up in the British Museum, and in fact another crown which ended up in the V&A, and again, a point to which I'll be returning. We also know that some objects were left behind in Ethiopia by the British troops. And one of the places in which these objects were left was the Church of Chelekot, which several British officers visited. And so one possibility was, of course, that these crowns were donated in 1868. But I personally am inclined to discount this opinion, because I don't think the British would have left behind an object that would have seemed as valuable as a crown, although again, this is perfectly possible. The second option, which is the one I favor, is that the crown was donated to this church, the Church of Chelekot Selassie, by its very founder, who was a nobleman called Ras Welde Selassie. Now, Ras is a title, an Ethiopic title that indicates the second highest rank in Ethiopia after the Negus, and it was a title used within the feudal military hierarchy of the Ethiopian emperor. Now, this Ras, who lived approximately between 1733 and 1815, came to be a really prominent figure in Ethiopian history between the late 18th and early 19th century. And in fact, he acted as a de facto ruler at a point in time when the emperors of Ethiopia, such as Tecle Georges I, who ruled between 1779 and 1800, were often too weak to keep control of the reins of the country, and were therefore turned frequently to little more than puppet rulers. And so for a long time, Ras Welde Selassie was the de facto ruler of much of northern Ethiopia. And in acting as a ruler, he also acted as a patron for the arts. And he supported the construction of churches, and he made a wealth of donations to Ethiopian churches, including the cathedral at Axum. But he seems to have held in particular favor the Church of Chelekot Selassie, to which he of which he sponsored the reconstruction in 1793. And what you're seeing to the left is a representation of what I believe is the probable donor of the crown, Ras Welde Selassie, who is portrayed in a prostrate position together with his consort beneath the depiction of the Virgin Mary as an act of humility. And to my mind, it is likely that upon founding the church, it was customary to also endow it with an assortment of objects which would have been necessary to perform the liturgy. And to my mind, it seems more likely that the crown would have reached the monastery at this point in time. Well, that's it for what concerns the sort of history, the symbolism, and the background of the crown. So I conveyed this information to Arthur. And at that point, the question was what to do next. And although, of course, this was it was a question for the Ethiopian government, we of course started to think to whom the crown should be returned. And the natural answer, of course, was to the original monastery. But of course, there might have been concerns at the same time that the crown could have been stolen again. So one wondered whether the crown might have gone to the Museum of Johannes in Mekele, or perhaps to the town of Gonda, where the crown was probably made, because that's where metal workers at this point in time resided in Ethiopia, or possibly to the capital, even to one of the national museums at the capital, such as Addis Ababa, as a way to showcase the richness of the heritage of Ethiopia, and also to encourage tourists perhaps to travel to the north of the country. But again, this was not a question for us to determine in any way. We just entertained it for the sake of it, and we thus released the press release about the crown's discovery, and it received a lot more attention in the press than we had initially expected, and most of the major newspapers platforms across the world ended up reporting the news. And at this stage, the two governments activated themselves. The Dutch government activated itself, and the Ethiopian government activated itself. And thus, a few months later, Sirac traveled with the crown to Ethiopia. And here you see him with a representative of the Dutch government, Dutch diplomat, returning the crown symbolically to Ethiopia's prime minister. Now, as I said, I invited Sirac to speak today, but he unfortunately couldn't make it, but he has sent me a message to show you on his behalf, which is what I'm going to show you right now. Sorry, this is a photograph of the ceremony of the actual return to the crown at the Church of Chelekot Selassie, which was co-organized by Mekele University.
Dear members of the Anglo-Ethiopian Society, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My apologies for not being able to be present live at this important event today. I very much appreciate the invitation of Dr. Jacob Ognisci to join. What I can do is share my views with you briefly through this recorded message. I'm also including some pictures of the return of the crown to Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed and the Ethiopian people. In this first slide, I'm showing you the first series of pictures of the crown taken early May 1998 in Rotterdam. Becoming the guardian of the Ethiopian religious crown 22 years ago did not happen lightheartedly. It happened because of my consciousness of being an Ethiopian. I have also been very aware of what my ancestors passed on to me, my Ethiopian identity, Ethiopia's culture, and the importance of Ethiopian heritage. This is all based on what I was taught as a child. I'm very happy to say I was raised traditionally and made aware of the strength of one united Ethiopia. It was my personal conviction that the crown had to return to the Ethiopian people. I'm sure you all know the story by now. I'm very grateful to Mr. Arthur Brandt, who first of all took all the necessary steps to make the return possible. But because of his approach, let us return the crown at the highest diplomatic level so that it will never disappear again. It also became possible to make it into a message I wanted to send. This awareness of being Ethiopian is crucial to the generations to come. It is my wish that young and future generations will know their ancient history and culture, and that they will safeguard their country. I also want to appeal to the British cultural sector and government to return all relevant Ethiopian artifacts to their true owners, the Ethiopian people. I'm assuming the Ethiopian government is negotiating seriously with cultural institutions to get back their precious artifacts. Having said that, I don't think it is up to anyone except the Ethiopians to decide on how to preserve and protect their own artifacts. That should not be a discussion. What the British, as good friends of Ethiopia, can do is this: help us with capacity building by teaching Ethiopian conservators and by assisting them in Ethiopia to conserve and to present our artifacts to the public. I'm convinced Ethiopian museums will be most happy with their expertise and willingness to help. In this last slide, you are witnessing the crown back to the Jellicoe Trinity Church, where it is presented to the people of Jellicoe. Thank you. Sirach has brought it down.
And so that was Sirach's message, again, for which I thank him. And so to round things up, Sirach, of course, mentioned a number of objects which are currently housed in collections across the UK. And I think if there is anything that this story can teach us, is that if there is political will to act, things can happen pretty quickly. And so I think the story of the return to this crown contrasts somewhat with the presence of another crown, another Ethiopian crown, in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was recently exhibited at an exhibition called Magdala 1868, which caused a considerable uproar in the press at the time because of the offer of the V&A's director to have returned the crown on long-term loan to Ethiopia. So hopefully this return of another crown can show that where there is a political will, there is also a pathway. And I've now the pleasure to pass the word on to my colleague, Michael Jervis, who, as I said, played a big part in the story by photographing the crown back in 1993. And Michael is a professor who teaches history and art history at the University of Toronto. He has been involved several decades in research and work and collaboration with and in Ethiopia. He has an extensive list of publications, and he's most recently been involved also in the study and documentations of rock-hewn churches in Ethiopia. Michael, on to you, and thank you for coming this evening.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me this afternoon in Toronto, evening where you are. I have been involved in documenting Ethiopian material culture for many years, and I've always started by using the camera. And I would like to go through a series of images to show the importance of this process of documentation, because in this example that we've been hearing about today, it is evident that if we didn't have photographs of where the crown came from, we might not have known where it should go back, or in many cases, whether it had come from Ethiopia in the first place. This is just one example of many. And if I may, I'm going to transfer, let's see now, to share my screen with you and look at a number of images, starting off with Chalakot as a place. This is the church which was built by Walda Selassie in the, I think Jacopo mentioned 1793. The monastery is a very fine example of Ethiopian art and culture. It has very rich collections, some of which were as a result of the return of, or the deposit of objects taken by the British from Magdala in 1868. We notice the screen around the outside of the church, very delicately put together, such that every opportunity that Ethiopians have to represent the cross comes across in all kinds of forms. And here we see that every piece of this screen has been made into a cross, highlighted by green. This is the head priest at the time I went to the monastery in 1993, a very honorable, generous, and gentle man. He had the misfortune of having been put in prison after the object or objects, I don't know what else went missing, but certainly after the crown went missing, because somebody had to be responsible, and this happens often enough in the country, that the person of highest rank is the one who is considered responsible. However, he was released and continued in his position. Here he is on the with another priest on the day that I visited, showing both that of the crown that we've been talking about and another. As I mentioned, this was a very, very rich collection of objects. Here is the crown by itself. And I must obviously tell you that when I took these photographs, I had no idea that I would be showing them, I beg your pardon, to you today. Looking a little further, this is an Ethiopian altar, if you like. It's called the Membra Tablet. Inside the little cupboard that you see at the top, there is the tablet, which is the holy stone representing the Ark of the Covenant and the 10 Commandments. Now, there is also in the outside the sanctuary another older one of this type, which is, like so many of the objects in Ethiopia, not in very good condition. As you can see, the entrance or the doorway to the Membra Tablet has been held together with wire. It is interesting, however, that on a door inside the church, there is a miniature, a mural painted showing a Membra Tablet of a very similar form, and which may have had in mind the very one that we were looking at. The priest is sensing it with his censer. The painting, we presume, belongs to this early period, late 18th, early 19th century. Now, in Ethiopia, in every church, there is what is known as an ikabet, or a storage room, or a treasure room, if you like. At Chalakot, it was in a very well-organized state, and I shall show you some other images of comparable ikabets as we go along. Just a matter of interest, what is hanging here is the wax, which would have been used for candles and the like. Wax is a big subject in Ethiopia. I think of it because I also do a lot of work with medieval English documents, and you frequently enough find references to people granting wax to monasteries during the Middle Ages, obviously to keep the lights on. The head priest brought out this enormous manuscript It's called The Faith of the Fathers. It practically takes, well, it does take two people to lift it. Inside, there's one of the miniatures is of the Council of Nicaea, with Constantine up here on the left, speaking to Eusebius in the presence of Jesus and some other bishops and kings. The artist used this marvelous device of eyes to keep everybody's attention on what was going on inside. As you go along this line, you find the person at the end always looking inwards here as well, rather than allowing one's attention to escape outside. Now, you also find historical documents. This is another manuscript of the Book of the Trinity from Chalakot Church, showing the assassination of King Yasu I in 1706. Yasu had abdicated and gone into a monastery, but that was not enough for his son, who decided he had to go, and so he had him shot. A detail from another manuscript from the collection of homilies of the Archangel Michael, a detail of the Empress Eudoxia. It is a classical story, but it does show what was available to artists at the time in the way of undoubtedly imported velvets and silks, which could often have come from the Indian Ocean, if not India itself. Eudoxia wearing this brilliant crown and necklace of gold. Now, also at Chalakot, there's a very rare example on the west wall of the sanctuary of the Virgin and Child, in which the Virgin is actually dressed in contemporary textiles. So here we have some fine silks, which the artist had incorporated into his painting. It does happen in a few other places in Ethiopia, but it is really quite a rare phenomenon. There is an exceptional series of paintings going around the inside of the church representing the apocalypse. Now, as far as I know, this is would be a fantastic PhD subject for a budding student or anybody further along the way in their research. Incredibly fine work of art, which up to this point has had no attention whatsoever. Here is a detail, as you can see, rather deteriorating, of contorted figures from that apocalyptic scene, or from others. But it goes on and on. It's a very long and involved story, but as I say, beautifully represented. Now, at the end of the day, we were invited to share injera with the high priest. I'm here together with some well-known figures of Ethiopian cultural history, Stanislaus Chojnacki, who was the founder of the museum at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, Paul Henza and his wife Martha, who contributed enormously to the collection of photographic data and articles about Ethiopian culture. This is Eva Belitska-Witakowska, sharing the hospitality of our very dear head priest. Here is Chojnacki and Henza, Chojnacki holding an altar cross, as it were, on one of our expeditions together, of which we made several. Now, I wanted to turn to sites other than Chalakot. Here, I show you a virtually unknown painting on the wall, painted directly onto the surface of the rock of a rock-hewn church called Gundufru in Tigray. This marvelous flying horse. You can somebody has taken the trouble to clean it a bit. That there's a lot more to this wall than you see in this photograph, but not very little of it has been cleaned. But it's the kind of thing that you find hidden in this case because of the smoke from the candles, which had blackened the walls. But I think that if this could be properly conserved or preserved, it would be a monument of Ethiopian's mural painting. Now we have another example from the Church of Yemrahana Christos in Ethiopia, which when we first saw it was absolutely covered with dust. So we dusted it, and it turned out to be one of the finest examples of Coptic painting that is known anywhere, even in Egypt. So there are things of this sort, in this case, painted. This is a built church. The mural is painted on the eastern wall of the northern nave, and shows enormous detail and painterly quality, presumably, or without question, from the 13th century. Now this is painted directly onto a plaster backing. Then we go to the Church of Debrecena, an early round church in Ethiopia on the northern shores of Lake Tana, where we begin to see some of the problems, of which there are many, about the conservation of mural painting. The paint is coming away, and it's here where I feel very strongly about the importance of photographic documentation, because Ethiopia is so rich in its material cultural heritage that it would be extremely difficult to conserve it in a proper manner. So over time, these works, I'm afraid, will be increasingly damaged and could well disappear. Here is another mural painting where you can see the result also of the flaking of the paint, done by the same painter. It's in a different church, but done by the same painter who worked on the apocalypse scene at Chellicott. Then a detail from a mural in a rock church, Wukro Maskal Krestos near Sakota. The figure is the wife of Dudenianos, who was a follower of St. George, and it was because she followed St. George she was martyred. Somebody has gone to the trouble to scrape off all of the surrounding painting in order to emphasize the figure of the wife of Dudenianos. How this happens, I don't know, but it's obviously something we would prefer to see avoided. Now here in another church in Tigray, Mariam Magdalawit, I took this photograph in 2005, and as we're looking, this is the built area of the church, but as you go through this portal, we are actually inside the rock. So it's a rock cut sanctuary. Well, in the last few years, the community decided the sanctuary and the church was too small, so they expanded it. An expansion of a rock cut church means that you have to destroy what was there before. So all of the original medieval rock cut sanctuary has now disappeared. Now there's another, you notice the walls are completely covered with mural paintings. And in this case, the murals are all painted on cloth from perhaps the mid 17th century. Ethiopians began to paint on cloth and then to glue the paint to the walls. This has its advantages and disadvantages, but in this case at Mariam Magdalawit, they had taken all the cloth paintings off the wall with the intention of putting them back up again afterwards. Now that is not always very successful, as you can see from this painting, where at some point the old mural had been taken down and then put up again, but not very well, and it was collapsing. Now here, an extraordinary example at the church of Mariam Dengalat, a church which had not been visited for some, well, not quite, for 200 years. And the only way you could get to it, as I did, was at the end of a 200-meter rope. But when I got inside, I found that all the walls had once been completely covered with frescoes, but somebody had taken down the entire set of frescoes on the north wall. The north wall is usually covered with paintings of equestrian figures. And so we wondered what had happened to them. And we found in the ikabate, the storage room, that these paintings had been used to fill the chinks in the walls of the ikabate against the wind. And as a consequence, you can see the condition. Now, that's not the only place. There are a number of churches in which these early mural paintings, and we have nothing before the late 17th, but really probably the 18th century in the way of mural paintings from certainly those painted on cloth. There was in this case, there were many of them which had been saved but not put up again. Absolutely extraordinary quality of the facial characteristics of the Virgin Mary in this painting, which is, for all intents and purposes, lost without a great deal of investment to preserve it. Now, the ikabate. This is the ikabate in around the year 2000 in the church of Gunda Gunde. Gunda Gunde has a collection of 219 manuscripts, all of which we digitized in 2006 to a number of 34,000 pages. They are now all available online through the University of Toronto for anybody who would like to have access to them. Now, what you don't see in this photograph, and which the monk did not want me to record, was that behind me was a series of jerry cans filled with fuel. He knew perfectly well that it wasn't a good idea to store the fuel with the manuscripts, but the fuel was considered to be a precious object, and so that's where it ended up. Now, I'll come back to that subject in a moment. Over here, there was a sheet, this green cover, and I said, well, what's underneath that? So they took it off and they showed me that, well, they said, these are the old manuscripts. Of course, old meaning some of these are perhaps as old as the 12th century, certainly 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, which were no longer used, but we did digitize them. So we feel strongly that even if they do disappear, as you'll see other examples, that we do have a complete record of their content. Now, the problem of storing manuscripts together with the fuel is that the ikabates frequently, far too frequently, burn. And we hear about these one example after another. Even the famous monastery of Debradamo, one of the founding monasteries from the 6th century, had a conflagration in its ikabate for the very same reason that the fuel was stored with the manuscripts. And as far as we know, they all went up in smoke. But anyway, here's an example from a gospel book which has suffered from fire. This is another, and here is a third, and a fourth in terrible condition. And there's just absolutely no way this is going to be able to be preserved because there are too many of them to preserve. Ethiopia has something like 1 million manuscripts in its churches spread about the country, many of them very ancient. Now, of course, when the conflagration begins, the best way to put it out is with water. So the second abuse to the poor manuscripts is that they burn and then they get doused with water. And so and once you douse parchment with water, it hardens and becomes brittle. And also it becomes very difficult to read. So this is the 15th century gospel book, which has suffered the same fate. Another problem are rodents. Historically, the custom in Ethiopia is to hang manuscripts in leather cases on the wall to keep on pegs in order to keep them away from the rodents. Unfortunately, this is not considered to be modern, so a lot of the manuscripts have come out of their containers and are placed in cabinets or even on the floor, and the rodents have their heyday with them. Here's another. This is a 15th century manuscript, which for all intents and purposes has lost its half of its content. And here is another, a degwa, a manuscript of ecclesiastical chants, which has been well devoured also by rodents. And then we have a very ancient monastery right on the border with Eritrea. It's called Ura in northern Tigray, where there are just so many manuscripts which need attention. They will never be read again. And I believe that Hamburg University may have digitized some of these manuscripts, but certainly not all. And unless they're made available online, we'll never know what's inside them. Now here is an example, Dagna in central Tigray, where they actually have a cabinet in order to keep their manuscripts, but they don't look after them very well. They don't lock the cabinet, and they don't even keep the door closed. I could say other things about this site, which was distressing because it was so rich in its content, but nobody, absolutely nobody, was interested in what they had. And here is another near Lake Tana, where you can see the state of a poorly kept ikabet. It would be wonderful if the priesthood and the monks in Ethiopia could be encouraged to look after their material heritage. Here we have a famous late medieval or early modern parchment fan at the top of Geralta again in Tigray. Very rare, very beautiful, but it's brought out to every visitor who comes who manages to walk to the top of the mountain, and in time it too will deteriorate, much in the way that this example from Haik Estefanos Monastery on Lake Haik, the individual images look quite good, but the fan has completely has come apart, as it were, and it's stretched across the wall of the sanctuary. And then we have other examples where in this rock-cut church, manuscripts, choirs, individual pages are just left scattered on the floor with no one to care for them. So there we have, we've looked at mural paintings and we've looked at manuscripts, and now we can just have a quick look at metalwork. This is the cover of the famous Abba Garima Gospels, attributed now to the 6th century, in which half of the back of the cover has disappeared. Then we have in another monastery near Mekele, a Mamluk 14th century inscribed plate, which has lost half of its rim. And in Lalibela, an original Lalibela cross, as it were, which has been bent in a fire, which is attributed to the attack by Grany in the 16th century. Whatever the case, it and another one from the same church, or same rock-hewn church in Lalibela, which has lost its handle. And from Chellicott itself, this cross, late medieval cross probably, which has had its top broken. And then it's by no means infrequently that we find examples of crowns such as this ecclesiastical crown, which are badly bent. And finally, we come to textiles. Now, Ethiopia is the proud possessor of the world's largest tablet woven silk hangings. They also are in the monastery of Abba Garima. Nobody, I don't think, appreciates the fact in Ethiopia that they have the only tablet woven hangings of their kind. Tablet weaving is a special method of weaving, which is otherwise completely unknown in Ethiopia. At any rate, this is one of the two, which is and this is the second one. And you can see that it used to hang in front of the sanctuary, and by use, the priest who passing in and out of the sanctuary has entirely worn away this part of the silk panel, decorated as it is with priests holding prayer sticks, or makwamia. So in this case, we were able to do something about it. We brought a textile specialist from Montreal. She managed to wash the hanging at Abagarima and backed it onto a strong cloth to preserve it, and it will now be preserved for some time to come. Now, not all of these tablet woven hangings, which are found in about 13 or 14 other places, all of them in Tigray, by the way, in terrible shape. This is at the monastery of Debre Bankal near Aksum, which is threadbare and soaked in oil. And another from Koraro in Tembian, which is all that survived of a similar hanging, but that burned in a fire in the 1940s. And finally, of the final, a swatch of tablet woven cotton hanging, which we found lying in the courtyard of the church in Atsbi, in the region of Atsbidera. So and that's the end of the images which I have to show you, but I do want to say how important it would be for us to be, and Ethiopians themselves, I would be quite happy to train Ethiopians on how to preserve their images through photography, preserve their objects through photography, but also it'd be extremely important if Ethiopia could institute a center for conservation and preservation, so that they could send their own experts out and look after their preservation. So that is a promotion for the photography of endangered objects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And we'll now be taking questions through Elizabeth.
Thank you very, very much, both of you. That was absolutely fantastic. 2 lectures for the price of 1. Fascinating story of the crown, and wonderful, wonderful photographs from Michael, although fairly distressing photographs and images of the state of the heritage. We are now taking questions. Could you use the chat function on your Zoom? You should have at the bottom of your screen a little speech bubble that says chat, and that will enable you to send us questions. I don't have any yet, but perhaps I could kick off by asking Jacopo particularly, what puzzles me a bit about the story of the stolen, somebody stole it. It's not just beautiful, it's not just historically important, it's clearly quite valuable in monetary terms. They stole it, and then they just put it in a suitcase and left it in an attic or somebody's. Do we have any idea what was going on, who stole it and what they were doing with it? They didn't seem to want to sell it or make money out of it. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I mean, this is, of course, a sensitive topic. I mean, my understanding is that the person who had it in his or her bag had taken it over to the Netherlands with a view of selling it off to pay and make money out of. Of course, it's not for me to comment really about the people involved in that particular development. It's for the Ethiopian government and the Dutch police to conduct investigations on the matter, because it's a sensitive topic. But I could add, I could add that the illegal trafficking of artwork out of Ethiopia is, of course, another. I mean, Michael has mentioned a number of problems that we have in terms of conservation, but the illegal export of artworks that then get sold in the black market is, of course, another serious problem that unfortunately needs to be tackled in some way. And these problems generally need joint responses from both within the country, from where the objects are exported, wherever it may be, but also from the countries where these objects are being taken.
If I may add, there's probably a slow but regular stream of objects which leave Ethiopia. I once had the experience of being offered to purchase a manuscript, and I said, no, that's quite forbidden. And they said, no problem at all. We'll give it to a donkey man who can carry it out to the Sudan. And that was the end of that. I mean, I didn't buy the manuscript, but I think that knowing that there are dealers and other purchasers in places outside Ethiopia who are prepared to pay a good deal of money for these objects, that route through the Simeon Mountains to the Sudan is probably fairly frequently visited by thieves. Not necessarily the people who remove them from the institutions from which they come. It's very seldom that the person who ends up with the object is the one who saw it out of its home institution. And then it goes into the hands of the donkey man, and the donkey man delivers it to somebody else, and eventually it makes its way to its destination. It's a sad story, and it's again very difficult to control.
And this is again where photography plays such a crucial role. It's essential both to photograph the objects, but also to sort of, I would say, make those photographs available in some form, and keep a record, a documentation of where those objects were originally kept from. It's much harder to illegally export or sell an object if it's documented than if it's undocumented.
I've got a message saying that the Ethiopian Heritage Fund does have a project for the museum at Chelakot. Do we have any update? Is the Crown going to there? Do we know anything more about that?
Well, I mean, among the people I reached out for in preparing this lecture, I mean, I also reached out to the Ethiopian Heritage Fund. For those who don't know it, it's a UK-based charity which attempts to raise money for funding conservation projects in cooperation with Ethiopian institutions. It strikes me as, in light of what we've seen, as a cause that is worthy of support. I know that they had plans for building a museum in Chelakot, where the Crown might be displayed. I think the plans haven't been scrapped, but are on hold.
And where is the Crown now? Is it just in the Ikabet?
I presume it's in the Ikabet of the church, yes.
So no more secure than it was before.
Security is a difficulty. A lot of churches and monasteries have an armed guard who stands by the Ikabet, or is certainly on the grounds in the event that there should be some lurking thief. But again, I don't think it's the lurking thief. I think there's some negotiation goes on which probably brings these pieces out of the monastery secretly.
Where is the market for these things? Is there not a very fashionable artifact? I know, for instance, that now China is so rich. Chinese historical artifacts have got very popular, very valuable at auction. I don't get the impression that Ethiopian things have got that kind of fashionable market, and presumably good museums wouldn't touch them. So where do they go?
Yes, I mean, presumably good museums wouldn't touch them, but it's also, I guess, not impossible to sort of fake provenance in some way, so that might be a way around it. Although museums nowadays are really, really careful with provenance, but I mean, there could be issues there. So it probably just goes on the black market. I mean, things, they probably might not fetch as much as say a stolen Picasso, but they would still fetch a large chunk of money, which would enable a person to sort of live comfortably for a year or two.
yes, and might restore the church's finances.
Well, I mean, the implication of whether or not the churches are involved in this, again, is not for me to comment upon. This is a matter for the Ethiopian government to look into.
What about the other? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say that the church has, the rural church in Ethiopia has suffered greatly from the fact that its lands were confiscated by the Derg in the 1970s. And I mentioned the monastery of Gunde, for example, which before the time of the Derg had 100 monks. But now, when I was there last, there were only 3. The monastery without its lands could not support them, so they had to give up their monastic life and go back to being farmers.
And to this point, I might add that it is essential. I mean, a key part of the conservation is ensuring that the people, the custodians of these objects, have the means to support themselves, and therefore have the means to keep. I mean, they've protected these objects for thousands of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years, even in some case, and they've done so successfully, and a lot more successfully than has sometimes been done in Western institutions. So the traditional knowledge for conservation is certainly there, but there also has to be the political will to provide the means to these institutions to be able to support themselves, to live comfortably, but also possibly to use these objects for a range of purposes, which could also include tourism and drawing income from tourism.
David Adler has got his hand up. David, what would you like to ask?
First of all, thank you for a fascinating couple of talks there. Can you please clarify the dating of the crown and if the visor date is later than the rest of the crown?
Yep. So again, with these things, anything which is based on formal analysis rather than technical analysis is always subject to a degree of personal judgment. My sense is I'm pretty confident that the inscription was added at the later date to the crown. Of course, the crucial question is establishing at which later date. Because at a later date can mean 30 seconds after the crown is finished, or it can mean 40 years or 50 years or 100 years after the crown is produced. So that's the question of when the inscription is added is a very difficult one to provide. Paleography is the art of estimating the date of an inscription based on its morphological features is a difficult and uncertain science, and it's even more complicated when it's on metal objects than when it is on a manuscript. So that's extremely hard to ascertain. But at the same time, the stylistic features of the crown do reconnect it to a number of other objects, which, and including manuscripts which have notes or something of the sort, which give us a slightly firmer chronology towards the 18th century. And it is on the basis of stylistic comparison with such objects that I'm suggesting a slightly later date.
Thank you. Okay. Was there any debate within Ethiopia as to exactly where the crown should be housed, given that we don't really know where it came from to Chellicott?
Again, this is not something that I followed because it wasn't for me to comment on. But I believe there was initially a debate as to where the crown would go, and I saw that there was the petition online which asked, again, I believe raised by someone from Mekelle University, asking for the return of the crown. If there's anyone from Mekelle University here that is willing to comment on this, of course, I'd invite them to say so.
Thank you, Sarah. I can see Jeffrey Ben Nathan's got his mic on. Did you want to ask something, Jeffrey?
Well, yes. I had written, actually, when Professor was talking to us from Toronto, I've written, I don't know how the chat works, but we're listening to an appalling litany of lack of concern, lack of appreciation for the importance of the preservation of cultural heritage. Could someone please reassert the case for returning Ethiopia's cultural heritage in the light of this astonishing neglect, is what I've written. And it's very sad, but it does seem to me, if I may say so, and it's a case made by an Ethiopian. I remember when Richard Pankhurst was advocating, which he was successful in, the return of the stellum from Italy to Aksum. one of the Ethiopians there said, actually said, you know, our heritage is being very well looked after in the museums of Europe, and as far as I'm concerned, they're better off that way. I remember that very clearly at an Anglo-Ethiopian Society meeting. So the question is reasserted, are not Ethiopian cultural relics, particularly things which are malleable, like manuscripts and textiles, much better looked after where they are now?
Well, again, it's a very sensitive question and a tricky one to answer. I'll do my best to try and navigate through it. It's easy to draw these two issues together because in both cases we are dealing with objects. My sense is that the two separate, although to some extent interconnected questions. I think it's essential for Western museums to sort of actively engage in cooperation with Ethiopian institutions to promote awareness of conservation. And I think that acts of return should ideally go hand in hand with cooperation and training of local Ethiopian personnel to sort of create to establish really a conservation school in Ethiopia. So that's something we really need to be in place. But one thing might promote another. The return of an object might encourage the government to invest more in conservation. So, for instance, the return of this crown, just as in this lecture, we are making a plea for the conservation of objects through the return of an object. The return of an object can also function as a channel for fostering such discussions. I mean, the key point is that of course the country has an absolute right to claim objects that used to belong to its history, and that's one issue. And then it's a separate discussion as to whether or not objects need to be conserved, and they clearly do in this case, as in many other countries. I was reading yesterday, a couple of days ago, an article in The Guardian which said that a number of wall paintings in churches across England are in dire need of conservation and risk disappearing. I mean, I just happen to talk about the necessity to conserve in Ethiopia because it happens to be the country I'm in love with. But it's not just the point being is that it's not just an Ethiopian phenomenon. It's also a Western phenomenon. I mean, but conservation is urgent, and many governments don't see it as their priority. I mean, I would say it's essential for governments across the world, be they in Europe or in Africa or anywhere, to fund conservation.
Michael, do you want to add to that?
Yes, and I would simply add that the problem, of course, is that conservation is extremely expensive, for which reason I promote photography at least as a means of documentation and recording what is there or what might not be there in the future. I have not done any serious documentation of antiquities in Ethiopia for 5 years because I was told I wasn't given authorization to do it. There was a concern, it became popularized that people like myself were in fact involved in what they call digital theft. In other words, we were somehow profiting from the photographs that we had been taken. I can honestly say I've never made a penny out of it, but you know, the Canadian government has always, and other sponsors have enabled me to go to Ethiopia in order to do this. But there's really no profit. And of course the answer, which I also promote, is that all the photographs that I take, I make available online, so that they're for everybody anywhere. And it would be, speaking of returning things to Ethiopia, obviously before they go, they should be photographed, but it'd be nice if we could also have more coming out of Ethiopia in the way of photographs, so that the scholars of the world could in fact have a better understanding of the wealth of material, which in fact is distributed throughout the country. It's very rich.
I would like just to add to what the scholars have just said, that from what I can glean about the issue actually runs even deeper than they have said, because we are assuming that there is, and this is not a criticism, human cultures are different and they have to be respected, but we are assuming that there is a fundamental ethos in Ethiopia for conservation, if only they had the money, if only this, if only that. And it may well be the case that there isn't this ethos.
There is this ethos, Jeffrey, because otherwise the objects wouldn't have been preserved for thousands of years that they had. I mean, there is this ethos, and as in all countries, as in all Western countries, and as in all Asian countries, there's all sorts of situations. There's situations where people can afford to conserve things and they do. There's situations where people can't afford them and they don't. There's situations where people don't care two hoots about conservation. And again, I gave the example earlier of England, where the sort of like 13th and 14th century wall frescoes that are in danger of damage too. So I really wouldn't try and paint a broad picture. I think in all these instances, there's always a case-by-case, very complex discussion that has to be carried forward with great caution and great respect.
Right, Laura?
I really don't have a question, but since I was called out, because I'm really listening, you know, when you listen, you can hear things that you're pondering be answered. But I mean, I would like to know, is anyone like a Jacopo, is it Jacopo? How do I pronounce it? Jacopo.
It's fine.
Jacopo.
Yeah,
Jacopo.
both are fine.
Okay, Jacopo. Have you done any type of research to know, like, aside from the part of it being stolen, but the history, more history about these artifacts? I heard you mention it's been, or the other guy mentioned it's been digitized, but have you guys gone deeper into the studying of what these artifacts were saying, what type of advices, or is it more like Jewish type of history, since this is Old Testament? Is it like a Jewish, or is it more Christianity? I'm interested to know, is it leaning more on the Jewish side or the Christianity side?
Well, again, that's a lot of questions, Michael.
Okay,
do you mind me starting?
No, please.
So to answer your first question, yes, I mean, I've just touched on some matters here. I've gone in considerable more depth in terms of scholarly research on the symbolism, function, history, and of these objects, and I have two forthcoming studies on the topic. One's Ethiopian, the Art Bulletin, and the other one in African arts. To answer your second question, there's long been an interest and a debate in trying to establish whether Ethiopian Christianity is somewhat Jewish or not. I mean, I think it's a somewhat spurious, artificial conversation, which is very much put forward by a modern way of thinking. It's an African Christianity, which draws in a considerable fashion on the Old Testament, and therefore the Old Testament, of course, has a number of customs and practices which then go back to different phases in the history of Judaism.
I got it. Okay. The reason why I'm asking this about, so you don't want to really categorize it as more like a Jewish practice. This is something they kind of formulated based on their culture in that region.
Yes, exactly. I'm just saying it's an indigenous cultural development, and I wouldn't try.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Michael, did you want to come in on that?
If I may just add that we don't hear very much about them, but there were several 14th century monastics who promoted the celebration of the Sabbath on the Sabbath. In other words, that the main service of the week should be on Saturday rather than on Sunday. And they got themselves, they had an enormous following, I think particularly in the north. But Evostatevos, who was the first of these in the 14th century, was eventually banished from the country, and Estefanos, who came along later in the century, was flogged and beaten, largely because the Orthodox Church, which was linked very closely with royalty, was discouraged by Alexandria from promoting what they then considered was a Jewish custom. However, you still find in Ethiopia today people who celebrate the Mass, their weekly Mass on Saturday. And in the 15th century, there was a huge dispute going on. People were killing themselves in the street or each other in the streets about it. King Zara Jacob, in 1450, I believe, announced that people could worship on the day of their choice, which meant either Saturday or Sunday. So these kinds of events do occur. And I must say that for someone from the Mediterranean world, either, should we say, Roman Catholic or Protestant, in particular, going to Ethiopia, they would feel immediately that they were in a recognizable space, but at the same time, they would be surprised that there are customs which they would associate with the Old Testament. And there's no question. I mean, there's no argument. I mean, if you look at the Bible today, the New Testament is a very small amount of the Bible. It's very clearly one on top of the other, one derived directly from the other. Perhaps more so in Ethiopia than in the Mediterranean world.
I think that's probably it.
Yep.
But
Thank
if
you.
you wanted to ask a question, you can unmute yourself now. No?
Or you're welcome to reach us by email.
Exactly. Well, thank you all. Thank you both enormously. That has been a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was just some background noise.
This is the moment when we would give you a round of applause, but we can't really give you a round of applause. I can see David is clapping there. Thank you very much. That has been an excellent presentation.